Hi, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we're stepping into a powerful new chapter, set against a world shaken by war. The story opens far from home, where the landscape is mud and thunder, but it isn't long before we're back among familiar voices in rooms altered by the times. This part carries both the weight of change and the quiet resilience of those finding their way through it. Wherever you are, I hope this story brings you some peace tonight. Chapter 1. The Somme, November 1916, Northern France. The world had collapsed into sound and fury. Each breath Matthew Crawley drew seared his lungs with the acrid tang of cordite, and something far worse, the sweet, metallic smell of blood that hung in the air like incense in a charnel house. His heart hammered against his ribs in time with the relentless percussion of the guns, those iron gods that had been devouring the earth for 4 endless months. The mud was alive. It clutched at his boots with greedy fingers, sucked at his ankles, dragged at every step, until his legs burned with the effort of simply moving forward. This was not the honest earth of Yorkshire fields, but something altogether more sinister, a glutinous soup of clay and rainwater and things he dared not name. It had transformed every man into a primordial creature, caked from head to foot in a second skin of filth that made them all look like participants in some grotesque medieval pageant. How many more? The thought hammered at Matthew's skull as he hauled himself over the lip of the trench. How many more boys will never see their mothers again? The mathematics of grief had become unbearable. In a single morning, entire villages had been erased from the earth. Schoolrooms across England would echo with empty desks. Church bells would toll for generations that would never come home. Behind him, shadows stumbled through the gray November light. Men who had charged into hell itself and somehow emerged on the other side. Their faces were masks of accumulated horror, eyes peering out like trapped souls from the mud that caked their features. They slithered down into the trench with gasps that sounded more animal than human, as if the very act of breathing had become a conscious struggle against the weight of what they had witnessed. The noise never stopped. It was a living thing that crawled inside your head and made itself at home there. The shriek of shells traced deadly arcs overhead, each one carrying the promise of obliteration. Somewhere in the maze of trenches, a man was crying for his mother in a voice that cracked like a boy's. The wet slap of boots in the boards echoed like a funeral march, played in a cathedral made of mud and sandbags. Matthew pressed his back against the trench wall, feeling the rough burlap of sandbags through his sodden uniform. The walls rose around him like the sides of a grave, reinforced with timber that wept moisture and smelled of rot. These trenches had been engineered with mathematical precision, narrow enough to contain the blast of grenades, zigzagged to prevent enfilade fire, but their very efficiency made them feel less like fortifications than like industrialized tombs. This is what we've made of the world, he thought, watching stretcher-bearers navigate the narrow spaces with infinite care. This is what civilized men do when civilization fails. A figure approached through the gloom, his uniform so thick with mud that he appeared more gargoyle than human. Only when he spoke did Matthew recognize the familiar voice of his Batman. "Is that you, Davis? How are we doing?" The man nodded, sending small avalanches of dirt cascading from his steel helmet. His eyes were startling in their cleanliness, 2 patches of humanity in a mask of primordial clay. "The stretcher bearers are with the boys now. Quite a few gone, I'm afraid, sir. The words hit Matthew like physical blows. Each casualty was a story that would never be finished, a future that would never unfold. Somewhere in England, mothers were going about their daily routines, unaware that their sons had already joined the ranks of the fallen. The postal services would carry that news across the channel like plague ships, bearing their cargo of sorrow. "Go back to the dugout," Matthew managed, his voice scraped raw from shouting over the artillery. "I just want a moment with Sergeant Stevens." As Davis melted back into the labyrinth of connecting passages, Matthew pushed forward through the cramped arteries of this underground city. Every step revealed fresh evidence of the morning's horror. Dark stains on the wooden duckboards, abandoned rifle clips that would never fire another round, discarded water bottles that still carried the warmth of their former owners. The trenches were a masterpiece of engineering, born from necessity and nightmare. They snaked across the scarred landscape in perfect zigzags, their walls lined with sandbags and corrugated iron, their floors covered with wooden boards that kept men's feet from sinking entirely into the mire. But for all their mathematical precision, they remained what they were, a vast network of scars carved into the flesh of the earth. A private soldier looked up as Matthew passed, his face barely visible beneath layers of accumulated filth. "Well done, sir." Matthew paused, studying the man's features as if trying to memorize them. In this place where death moved like a harvest reaper, every face might be the last time you saw it whole. "Well done to all of us. Who are you?" "Thompson, sir." "Then yes, well done." The words felt pitifully inadequate. How did you acknowledge courage that transformed ordinary farm boys and shop clerks into heroes? How did you honor men who faced annihilation with nothing more than grim determination and the bitter love they bore for their comrades? Sergeant Stevens stood among the wounded like a shepherd tending his broken flock. His stripes were barely visible beneath the accumulated grime of battle, but his bearing remained unmistakably military, straight-backed, competent, the sort of man who formed the steel backbone of any fighting unit. When he saw Matthew approach, he straightened into a salute that somehow retained its dignity despite their surroundings. "Sir, I want every wounded man taken down the line before it starts to get dark," Matthew commanded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like a lead cape. "We've bloody well lost enough of them for one day." Stevens nodded with the understanding of a professional soldier. They both knew the brutal arithmetic of war. As darkness fell, the stretcher-bearers would become targets themselves. Every minute that passed increased the chances that the wounded would join the ranks of the dead. Matthew left the sergeant to his grim work and navigated back through the maze toward his dugout. The passages were barely wide enough for one man, carved directly from the earth and reinforced wherever possible with scavenged timber and sandbags. Men had scratched caves from the walls, primitive shelters that offered the illusion of protection in a world where protection had become the most dangerous of dreams. The dugout was a hole in the ground, nothing more, but it represented the closest thing to sanctuary this place offered. A paraffin lamp burned with a steady flame that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. The air was thick with the smell of lamp oil, damp earth, and unwashed humanity. Davis was already there, looking even more grotesque in the confined space, his mud-caked uniform making him appear like some ancient bogman disturbed from his eternal rest. On the makeshift desk, a plank balanced precariously on ammunition boxes, lay an envelope. The sight of it hit Matthew like a physical shock. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, bearing an address written in elegant script that belonged to a world where such refinements still mattered. It seemed as alien in this place as a butterfly would in a coal mine. "When did this arrive?" Matthew asked, though he was already reaching for it with hands that trembled from more than cold. Without waiting for an answer, he tore open the envelope. The letter inside was written on paper so fine it seemed to glow in the lamplight. As he read, a profound disconnection settled over him like fog rolling in from the sea. The words described a universe that operated according to entirely different laws, a place where the greatest crisis might be a broken water pipe or a disagreement over dinner seating arrangements. "They're still living in the world I remember," he thought, feeling dizzy with the impossibility of it, while we've fallen through the looking glass into hell itself. "Good news," he said finally, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. "We're to be relieved today by the Devons. The men can finally get some rest, and I've got a few days' leave coming to me." Davis looked up from cleaning Matthew's Sam Brown belt, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in a draft. "What will you do with them, sir?" "Oh, London first, to remind myself what real food tastes like. Then north for a couple of days, I suppose." Matthew managed what he hoped was a reassuring smile, though his face felt stiff as a mask. "Naturally, there's a girl I want to see while I'm there." "So I should hope, sir." They shared a chuckle, but even as he laughed, Matthew felt the weight of unreality pressing down upon him. The idea of drawing rooms and dinner parties, of servants who worried about proper serving temperatures rather than incoming artillery, it all seemed as fantastical as stories from Arabian Nights. "It's strange, isn't it?" Davis said, unknowingly echoing the thoughts that churned through Matthew's mind. "To think of our old lives just going on as before, while we're here, in this." "It's more than strange," Matthew replied softly. "When I think about my life at Downton, I feel like Heinrich Schliemann excavating Troy. Every part of that existence seems like another world." And it was true. The great house on its hill, the servants moving through their ancient choreography, the family gathering for meals served on china that bore no scars from shrapnel. All of it belonged to a different man who had lived in a different century. That Matthew Crawley, the one who had worried about inheritance laws and estate management, felt as distant as a character from a history book. The letter in his hands spoke of garden parties and village concerns, of small social dramas that had once seemed important. It was written in a language he could still understand, but no longer quite speak, composed by people who continued to believe in the permanence of things, in the possibility of a future that resembled the past. But here, in the mud-lined womb of his dugout, surrounded by the endless thunder of the guns, Matthew knew with terrible certainty that such faith was as dead as the thousands of boys who would never see another English spring. The world that letter described might as well have been located on one of the distant stars that shone over no man's land on clear nights. It existed, certainly, but the distance between here and there could not be measured in mere miles. The gulf was unbridgeable, not between Yorkshire and France, but between the man who had left Downton Abbey and the creature who now sheltered in this hole in the ground. He could remember garden parties and county fairs with perfect clarity, but they felt like memories inherited from someone else. Scenes from a play he had once attended, but never actually performed in. Outside, the guns spoke their iron language to the gathering dusk, and the great machine of war prepared for another night of mechanical slaughter. But inside the fragile sanctuary of the dugout, lit by the steady flame of the paraffin lamp, Matthew Crawley sat with a letter from a lost world in his trembling hands, and wondered if the man who might someday return to that place would be anything more than a ghost wearing familiar clothes. Chapter 2. A House in Transition. The great hall of Downton Abbey had been transformed into something resembling a theatrical workshop run by benevolent madmen. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating a scene of controlled chaos that would have sent the late Victorian masters of the house spinning in their marble tombs. Sawdust danced in the golden beams as workmen hammered together a makeshift stage, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling with a vigor that spoke of honest labor rather than the hushed reverence typically demanded by these ancient walls. Carson stood at the heart of it all, like a general surveying a battlefield, his black-clad figure rigid with the particular tension that came from watching centuries of protocol being cheerfully dismantled in the name of patriotic duty. The banner that stretched between the galleries, "Help our hospital, and you are helping our boys at the front," seemed to mock him with its bold, democratic simplicity. This was not how things were done at Downton Abbey, but then again, nothing was done as it should be anymore. The sound of hammering punctuated the morning air like irregular gunfire, each blow driving home the uncomfortable truth that the war had breached even these hallowed walls. The servants moved with purpose around the construction, their usual choreography disrupted by the presence of outsiders and the necessity of accommodating something as vulgar as public entertainment. The very air seemed to vibrate with industry and innovation, qualities that had always existed here, but never so openly, never so boldly displayed for all the world to see. Anna crossed the space with measured steps, her movements graceful even as she navigated around workmen and their equipment. Beside her walked a newcomer, a young woman whose every gesture seemed to challenge the invisible boundaries that governed life in a great house. Ethel Parks possessed the sort of beauty that drew attention whether she wished it or not. Dark hair that caught the light despite being pinned severely back, eyes that missed nothing, and a bearing that suggested she considered herself the equal of anyone in the room. "We normally have everything done before the family wakes up," Anna explained, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone accustomed to training new staff. "But it's all at 6s and 7s today. I'll go through it with you tomorrow when we're back to normal." Ethel's response came with a slight toss of her head, a movement so subtle that anyone watching might have missed it entirely. But Anna caught it and felt a small chill of recognition. She had seen that gesture before, in girls who believed the world owed them something more than service. "I do know how to run a house." The words fell into the air with the weight of a challenge, not the quiet, respectful protest of a servant defending her competence, but something altogether different, a declaration of independence wrapped in the language of professional confidence. Anna felt the delicate machinery of hierarchy shudder at the casual dismissal of her authority. This was not how conversations between senior and junior staff were conducted. This was not how things worked. She doesn't understand yet, Anna thought, studying the girl's defiant profile. She thinks this is just another job, another house. She has no idea what she's walked into. But there was something else in Ethel's manner that Anna recognized with uncomfortable clarity. It was the restless energy of someone who had grown up in a world that was changing, someone who had absorbed the new ideas that were spreading like wildfire through the working classes. The notion that a person need not accept the circumstances of their birth, that ambition was not a sin, that dreams of something better were not merely foolish fantasies. The times were changing, certainly. The war had accelerated processes that might otherwise have taken decades to unfold. Young women, who might once have been content to spend their lives polishing silver and arranging flowers, now read magazines filled with stories of shopgirls who became actresses, of typists who married their employers, of ordinary people who transformed themselves into something extraordinary. The rigid structures that had governed English society for centuries were beginning to crack under the pressure of new possibilities. As they entered the library, Anna couldn't help but notice how Ethel's eyes swept the room, not with the awed reverence of someone seeing wealth beyond their comprehension, but with the calculating gaze of someone taking inventory. It was the look of a person who saw not a shrine to aristocratic tradition, but simply another collection of objects that could be learned, managed, and perhaps eventually owned. In the master's dressing room, a different sort of tension filled the air, like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. Robert Crawley, Earl of Grantham, stood before his mirror as William struggled with the intricacies of military dress uniform. The young footman's hands trembled slightly as he attempted to fasten the unfamiliar straps and buckles, his inexperience evident in every fumbling movement. The uniform itself was magnificent, scarlet wool adorned with gold braid, polished brass buttons that caught the morning light, and decorations that spoke of honor and tradition. But wearing it felt like participating in an elaborate charade, and Robert's reflection seemed to mock him with its martial splendor. He looked every inch the soldier, yet he knew with bitter certainty that he was nothing more than a man playing dress-up in clothes he had not earned the right to wear. "It goes under the epaulette," Robert said, his voice carrying the particular edge that came from being helped by someone who knew less than he did about something he should have known instinctively. William's face flushed with embarrassment as he corrected his mistake. "I'm sorry, my lord. If I'd known, I'd have asked Mr. Bates about it before he left for London." The mention of his proper valet sent a pang of irritation through Robert's chest. Bates would have had him dressed and ready in half the time, with none of this fumbling uncertainty. Bates understood uniforms, understood the weight of military tradition, understood the difference between merely wearing clothes and truly embodying what they represented. "Because I'll be in uniform a lot of the time in future," Robert said, more to himself than to William. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. "Does being Lord Lieutenant mean you're back in the army?" William asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that only served to highlight Robert's frustration. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Robert felt his jaw tighten as he considered how to answer. How did one explain the humiliation of being offered a position that sounded important, but meant nothing? How did one admit to being deemed too old, too soft, too irrelevant for the real business of war? "Not exactly," he replied, each word carefully chosen. "The Lord Lieutenant is responsible for the army in the county while the war's on. Maneuvers, training, recruitment, and, of course, the territorials." He caught his own eye in the mirror and saw the truth reflected there. a middle-aged man desperately clinging to the illusion of relevance, dressed in a uniform that marked him as nothing more than a ceremonial figurehead. The real soldiers, men like Matthew Crawley, were dying in the mud of France while he played at being military in the comfort of Yorkshire. As he looked, he felt a flash of envy, even resentment, for the man who was in the thick of it, facing the real fight. It wasn't just disappointment. It was a profound, suffocating shame. But no, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I'm not back in the army. It appears they don't want me. The admission fell from his lips like a confession in the privacy of a confessional. He had offered his services the day after war was declared, had been prepared to leave his estate, his family, his comfortable life to serve his country as he had served it as a young man in South Africa. But the reply had been swift and brutal in its politeness. His experience was valued, but his active service was not required. Too old? The words had not been spoken, but they had echoed in every line of the carefully worded rejection. The army had moved beyond the need for gentlemen officers who remembered cavalry charges and believed in the power of breeding over training. This was a modern war, fought by younger men with more recent experience and fewer illusions about the glorious nature of combat. William continued to work at the uniform fastenings, his movements growing more confident as he became familiar with the system. But Robert could see the question in the young man's eyes, could sense the internal struggle that played out behind his carefully neutral expression. Your lordship, William began hesitantly, can I ask a question? Only, when they brought conscription in, I thought I'd be called up straight away. I'm young and fit. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Robert understood the boy's dilemma with perfect clarity. Here was a young man in the prime of his life, physically capable of serving his country, yet held back by circumstances beyond his control. The contrast between William's forced inaction and Robert's chosen irrelevance was not lost on either of them. You could always enlist, Robert suggested, though he knew even as he spoke that it was not a real option. I would, but it's difficult. The euphemism covered a multitude of complications. Robert knew about William's father, a widowed man who had already lost so much, and could not bear the thought of losing his only remaining son. It was the sort of private tragedy that played out in countless households across the country, the cruel mathematics of love and duty that the war had imposed on ordinary families. You know your own mind, Robert said, though he felt the inadequacy of the response. But when I am called up, I won't be sorry. I'll be glad. The declaration came with the fierce intensity of youth, and Robert recognized in it something he had once possessed himself, the burning desire to prove oneself worthy, to stand among the ranks of those who had answered their country's call. It was a feeling he remembered with painful clarity from his own young manhood, when the prospect of action had seemed like the highest possible honor. Just try to be ready, Robert said quietly. You don't have to be glad. The words carried more weight than their simple syntax suggested. Robert had seen war, had smelled the cordite and the blood, had watched good men die for reasons that seemed less clear with each passing year. The boy's eagerness was both admirable and heartbreaking, the enthusiasm of someone who had never seen what war actually meant, who still believed in the romance of service and sacrifice. But perhaps That was as it should be. Perhaps the illusions were necessary, the myths essential. How else could any nation ask its young men to march toward almost certain death? How else could mothers send their sons away with smiles and blessings? The truth about war, the mud and the screaming and the absolute waste of it all, was perhaps too terrible to be borne without the comforting lies about honor and glory and noble sacrifice. As William finished with the uniform, Robert caught sight of his reflection once more. He looked magnificent, every inch the military commander. But the mirror could not disguise the fundamental fraud of it all. The reality that he was playing soldier, while real soldiers died in trenches he would never see. The scarlet and gold proclaimed his importance while highlighting his irrelevance, announced his authority while underlining his impotence. The war was changing everything, transforming not just the maps of Europe, but the very foundations of English society. Young men like William were discovering that their fate lay in the hands of conscription boards and military necessity, rather than family loyalty and personal choice. Men like Robert were learning that their experience and breeding counted for nothing against the cold mathematics of modern warfare. And in the spaces between the old certainties and the new realities, everyone was struggling to find their place in a world that no longer followed the rules they had been taught to revere. Chapter 3. News from the Front. The dining room at Downton Abbey had always followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. The soft clink of silver against china, the measured footsteps of servants, the rustle of newspaper pages being turned with practiced precision. But this morning, even this most sacred of domestic rituals bore the scars of war's intrusion. The very air seemed charged with nervous energy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Robert stood at the sideboard, the morning light catching the silver serving dishes that gleamed despite their reduced numbers. Half the footmen had vanished into khaki uniforms, and the remaining staff moved with the particular efficiency of people doing the work of twice their number. He helped himself to eggs that had become precious commodities, kidneys that spoke of a larder growing steadily more bare, toast made from flour that would only become scarcer as the months wore on. The weight of his new uniform felt different this morning. Not the theatrical costume it had seemed in his dressing room, but something approaching legitimacy. He could feel Cora's eyes upon him as he settled into his chair, could sense her unspoken questions hovering between them like morning mist. "We don't often see you in here for breakfast," he observed, noting his wife's unusual presence at this early hour. Cora's response carried the particular weariness of someone who had spent a sleepless night contemplating unwelcome possibilities. "Isabel said she was coming up to help, and your mother threatened to look in. No doubt they would love it if they found me still in bed." The mention of his mother sent a familiar flutter of anxiety through Robert's chest. The Dowager Countess possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear precisely when her presence would prove most discomfiting, armed with observations that cut straight to the heart of whatever inadequacy you were attempting to conceal. "I don't know what Mama can do," he said, though they both knew that Violet's contributions rarely involved actual physical labor. "What does she always do? Frighten us into submission." Robert had begun opening his correspondence, a ritual that had once brought the pleasant anticipation of social invitations and estate business, but now carried the constant possibility of devastating news. The letter in his hands, however, brought something altogether different. As he read, his face transformed, years seeming to fall away as genuine excitement replaced his usual morning melancholy. "I don't believe it," he breathed, his voice carrying the wonder of a child discovering an unexpected gift. Cora looked up from her coffee, hope flickering in her eyes. "Please say it's something nice." "Nice? It's absolutely marvelous." The words tumbled out with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. "General Robertson's invited me to be colonel of the North Riding Volunteers. The Lord Lieutenant would be a welcome addition to their number. And this is the best bit. It may please you to know that the idea was given to me by General Haig." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Douglas Haig, the man who commanded the British Expeditionary Force, who held the lives of thousands in his hands, who had somehow thought of Robert Crawley in connection with active service. The validation was intoxicating, the sense that he might matter after all, that his experience and breeding might yet prove valuable in this modern war. "What difference does that make?" Cora asked, though she could already see the answer written across her husband's face. "Well, if Haig's involved, it means I'm back in the army properly. Well, thank you, God." Robert's gratitude was directed not just heavenward, but toward a universe that had finally remembered his existence, that had found a use for skills he had feared were obsolete. Here was proof that the old ways still held value, that breeding and experience could triumph over the cold arithmetic of modern warfare. But Cora's American practicality cut through his euphoria like a blade through silk. "How can that be? You were told you weren't wanted for active service. You can't jump in and out of the army like a jack-in-a-box." The observation stung because it contained a kernel of truth that Robert preferred not to examine too closely. There was something almost desperate in his eagerness to grasp at this opportunity, something that spoke of a man who had watched younger, presumably better men, march off to glory while he remained behind to manage fundraising concerts and recruitment drives. "I don't see why not," he protested, grasping for historical precedent. "Churchill went back to the front after the Gallipoli business, commanding the Fusiliers. If he can do it, why shouldn't I?" The comparison was not entirely flattering. Churchill's return to active service had been less a triumphant comeback than a form of exile, a way of removing an embarrassing figure from the corridors of power. But Robert was beyond such subtleties now, carried away by the prospect of redemption. The conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from across the table, a barely audible intake of breath that carried more weight than a scream. Sybil sat frozen over her correspondence, her face drained of color, her hands trembling as they held a letter that seemed to burn like acid between her fingers. "Sybil, are you all right?" Robert's military concerns evaporated in the face of his daughter's distress. Sybil stood abruptly, the movement sending her chair scraping against the polished floor. "Excuse me, I think I'll just—" But she couldn't finish the sentence. Words seemed to have deserted her entirely, leaving only the raw geography of loss etched across her features. She hurried from the room, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence she left behind. Cora's maternal instincts warred with hard-won wisdom as she watched her youngest daughter flee. "She's had more bad news. Shall I go after her?" "Leave her," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience. "There's bad news every week now, and she has to learn how to deal with it. We can't protect any of them from the war, and we shouldn't try. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the acknowledgement of powerlessness that haunted every parent in England. This was the mathematics of modern warfare, not just the industrial slaughter of young men, but the systematic destruction of innocence, the gradual erosion of everything that had once seemed permanent and safe. Sybil's generation had come of age believing in garden parties and tennis tournaments, in seasons that followed predictable patterns, and futures that could be planned with reasonable certainty. Now they lived in a world where every morning's post might bring news that another piece of their universe had been obliterated, where the young men they had danced with at their first balls were disappearing into the hungry maw of the Western Front. Cora finished her coffee in silence, understanding with painful clarity that this was perhaps the most difficult lesson of parenthood, learning when to stop protecting your children from a world that no longer offered the luxury of protection. The war had made adults of them all, whether they were ready or not. In the servants' hall below, the morning's tensions manifested not in tearful exits, but in the sharp scrape of cutlery on plates, and a conversation crackling with unspoken resentments. Anna cleaned jewelry with a slow, methodical rhythm, her thoughts far away. William sewed a button on a shirt, his large hands fumbling with the dainty thimble, his brow furrowed in concentration. Branson read a newspaper with an intensity that suggested he was looking for confirmation of a world order he already knew to be rotten at its core. The relative quiet was broken by the entrance of a flustered Daisy, followed closely by a formidable Mrs. Patmore, who was wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Where's the batter for the pancakes?" Mrs. Patmore demanded of the room at large. "It's in the cold larder," Daisy replied meekly. From her seat, Ethel paused in the meticulous filing of her nails, an expression of languid interest on her face. "Are we having pancakes tonight?" It was O'Brien, entering behind Mrs. Patmore, who answered, "Are we as like?" "Upstairs dinner," Mrs. Patmore announced with a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 menus. "Crêpe Suzette's." A flicker of genuine longing crossed Ethel's face. The name itself sounded exotic, decadent, a taste of a life she read about in magazines but had never experienced. "Oh, I've always wanted to try those," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too hopeful. "Could you save me some, if they don't finish them all?" The request fell into the room like a dropped plate. It was a breach of protocol so fundamental that for a moment, everyone simply stared. Mrs. Patmore's face darkened. "Save you some crepes Suzette's?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Ethel, however, was undeterred. "If you don't mind, what are we having?" "Lamb stew and semolina," Mrs. Patmore snapped. The contrast was stark, brutal. The upstairs world of delicate, sweet pancakes, the downstairs world of functional, heavy stew. "Don't you fancy that, dear?" Mrs. Patmore asked, her tone dripping with sarcastic sweetness. "Not all the time," Ethel replied honestly, missing the sarcasm entirely. It was this innocence, this refusal to accept the unwritten rules of her station, that was so infuriating. "Oh, I see," the cook retorted, her temper finally snapping. "Would you like to sleep in her ladyship's bedroom while you're at it?" "I wouldn't mind," Ethel said, with a surprising seriousness that silenced the room once more. "I hate sharing a room. I didn't in my last place." As Mrs. Patmore stormed out in a huff, O'Brien fixed Ethel with a long, measuring look. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but carried a far more dangerous edge than the cook's shouting. "You've got a cheek on your first day." Ethel met her gaze without flinching. "I don't see why. I want the best, and I'm not ashamed to admit it." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the worn faces and the weary acceptance of her fellow servants. Her next words were quieter, but burned with a fierce, almost desperate conviction. "I think it's hard to change at your age. I don't blame you, but I suppose in the end, I want to be more than just a servant." The declaration hung in the air, a profound challenge to the entire structure of their lives. It was not just impertinence, it was a revolution in miniature, and in that moment, Miss O'Brien knew she had found a weakness in the new girl she could exploit to devastating effect. The country roads around Downton had never been designed for the mechanical marvels that now traveled them with increasing frequency. The motor car that bounced and lurched along the rutted lane seemed as out of place as a circus elephant in a drawing room, its engine coughing and sputtering with the particular protestations of early automotive engineering. Behind the wheel, Edith Crawley gripped the steering column with a determination that bordered on the ferocious. Her knuckles were white beneath her driving gloves, her jaw set with the particular stubbornness that had always marked her as the most willful of the Crawley daughters. Beside her, Branson maintained the patient demeanor of a man who had learned that teaching driving required reserves of courage that would have been admired on any battlefield. The machine lurched forward with a grinding of gears that made both passengers wince. Edith's foot found the clutch with all the delicacy of a blacksmith's hammer, sending the car into a series of violent jerks that threatened to dislodge both occupants from their seats. "We ought to go back," Branson suggested diplomatically, one hand braced against the dashboard. "I'm taking his lordship into Catterick at 10. "A bit longer, please," Edith replied, her voice carrying the particular intensity of someone who refused to accept defeat. "I do think I'm getting better, don't you?" Branson's response was measured with Irish tact. "Up to a point, milady." The grinding rasp of protesting gears punctuated his words, as if the machine itself were offering commentary on Edith's progress. She pressed the clutch again, this time with marginally more success, and the car lurched forward with slightly less violence than before. "If you could just get the clutch right down to the floor," Branson instructed, his voice carrying the patience of a man who understood that mechanical skills could not be inherited along with titles and estates. "But I am," Edith protested, though even as she spoke, another grinding rasp suggested otherwise. "Not quite, milady." The correction was gentle, but it highlighted the fundamental challenge that faced women of Edith's class in this changing world. They had been raised to be ornamental rather than practical, to command rather than to perform, to exist within carefully defined boundaries that were now being redrawn with bewildering speed. Before the war, Edith's most ambitious undertaking might have been organizing a church bazaar or teaching Sunday school to village children. Her accomplishments were measured in watercolor sketches and competent French conversation, in the ability to manage a household staff and navigate the intricate protocols of country society. But now, with half the able-bodied men of England vanishing into military service, such limited skills seemed not just inadequate, but almost criminally wasteful. "It doesn't seem to want to go," Edith said, wrestling with the gear lever, as if it were a living thing that could be bullied into submission. "I think it wants to, if you ask it properly," Branson replied, his voice carrying a note of encouragement that was not entirely convinced of its own optimism. That's better. You'll be putting me out of a job. The observation was meant as a compliment, but it carried darker implications that neither of them chose to examine too closely. The call-up notices were working their way through the eligible men of the county with the methodical efficiency of a harvesting machine. Soon there would be precious few chauffeurs left to worry about employment. Won't the call-up put you all out of your jobs? Edith asked, voicing the question that haunted every household in England. Branson's response was carefully neutral. I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. They spoke of a man who understood that his future, like everyone else's, had become a matter of chance and circumstance rather than choice and planning. The war had reduced all their lives to a series of provisional arrangements, temporary solutions to problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be solved. As they negotiated another particularly challenging section of road, Edith's concentration was absolute. Her world had narrowed to the immediate demands of clutch and accelerator, steering wheel and gear lever. But beneath the mechanical challenges lay something deeper, a profound need to prove that she could master something real, something useful, something that might actually matter in the transformed world they were all struggling to navigate. The war had opened possibilities for women that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Across England, ladies who had never done more than arrange flowers were learning to drive ambulances, to manage farms, to take on responsibilities that had always been the exclusive province of men. It was a transformation born of necessity rather than ideology, but it was no less profound for being accidental. Edith gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the weight of expectation and possibility pressing down upon her like a physical force. She might not have Sybil's passionate conviction or Mary's natural confidence, but she possessed something equally valuable, the stubborn determination of someone who refused to be left behind by history. The mechanical beast beneath her hands might resist her efforts, but she would master it eventually. She would find her place in this new world, whatever it cost her. The future was racing toward them all, with the unstoppable momentum of the war itself, and Edith Crawley intended to meet it head-on, even if she had to learn to drive through sheer force of will. Chapter 4. An Engagement and a New Resolve. The library at Downton Abbey had always served as a sanctuary from the more theatrical aspects of family life. Its leather-bound volumes and mahogany furnishings spoke of permanence and tradition, of a world where knowledge accumulated slowly and wisdom was passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. But this afternoon, even this most stable of environments seemed to tremble with the vibrations of a world coming apart at its carefully constructed seams. Robert and Cora had sought refuge here after the morning's disruptions, settling into chairs that had welcomed the weight of countless previous conversations. The autumn light filtered through tall windows, casting familiar shadows across familiar objects. Yet somehow everything felt different now. Provisional, temporary, as if the very foundations of their existence had developed hairline cracks that might spread at any moment. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor carried an ominous quality that made both of them look toward the door with something approaching apprehension. It was Violet who swept into the room first, of course, her black silk rustling with each movement, her walking stick striking the floor with the authoritative tap of someone who expected the world to arrange itself according to her preferences. But she was not alone. Following in her wake was Isabel Crawley, whose measured steps and grave expression suggested she was not here for a casual social call, but as the bearer of significant news. The two women made for a stark contrast. Violet, the grande dame preparing for a familiar theatrical performance, and Isabel, the harbinger of a reality that could not be managed with a cutting remark. "Oh, well, I'm sure we won't be disturbed," Violet announced, her tone suggesting that any attempt at disturbance would be met with swift and decisive retaliation from them both. Anna, who had been tidying the flower arrangement, immediately recognized the signs of an impending family discussion. She gathered her cloth and retreated with discreet efficiency. "Please," Robert said, rising and gesturing toward two empty chairs, with the resigned air of a man who understood this joint visit could not possibly bring good news. "Well, the thing is, I've had a letter from Matthew," she began, her voice carrying the precise cadence of someone who had rehearsed this moment, but still found it difficult to navigate. "Of course, he never tells me what he's actually doing." The observation carried weight beyond its simple meaning. They all understood the unspoken reality, that letters from the front were exercises in careful omission, that the young men fighting in France had learned to write around the truth rather than through it. The real war existed in the spaces between the lines, in what was not said rather than what was. "No, he wouldn't," Robert replied, his voice soft with understanding. "But I'm glad he's all right. I miss him." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with all the complicated emotions that surrounded Matthew's absence. He was, technically, the heir to everything Robert valued most in the world, yet their relationship had always been complicated by the circumstances that had brought him into their orbit. Now, with the possibility that he might never return, those complications seemed both more important and utterly insignificant. "Well, that's the point," Isabel continued, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap. "You must know he's been here a few times since the war started." The words carried an undercurrent of accusation that made the atmosphere in the room shift subtly. Everyone was aware that Matthew had visited the village without calling upon the family, that he had maintained a careful distance from the very people who should have been his primary connection to home. "We had heard," Cora said quietly, her voice carrying the particular hurt of someone who had been deliberately excluded from something important. "Downton is hardly a metropolis," Violet observed with her characteristic acidity, her tone suggesting that anyone who could visit the area without paying proper respects was demonstrating a fundamental failure of breeding. "He wasn't being rude," Isabel said quickly, though her defense sounded somewhat half-hearted even to her own ears. "He just felt it was better to keep a wide berth." The euphemism covered a multitude of emotional complexity. Everyone in the room understood that Matthew's distance had everything to do with Mary and the painful conclusion of their relationship. Some wounds were too fresh to risk reopening, some conversations too dangerous to attempt. "Is he still determined to go back to Manchester when it's all over?" Robert asked, voicing the question that had haunted him since the war began. The possibility that Matthew might survive the fighting only to disappear from their lives entirely was almost too painful to contemplate. "He doesn't talk much about life after the war," Isabel replied, her voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who had learned not to plan too far into an uncertain future. "None of them do. I suppose they don't want to tempt fate. Until now, that is." She paused, gathering herself for the blow she was about to deliver. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with the terrible anticipation of news that could not be recalled once spoken. He writes that he is engaged to be married to a Miss Lavinia Swire. The words fell into the room like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread outward from their point of impact. For a moment, nobody spoke. The very air seemed to vibrate with the implications of what had just been revealed. Violet was the first to recover her composure, though her voice carried a brittle quality that suggested her sang-froid was costing her considerable effort. Well, I suppose we all knew it would happen one day. The observation was characteristically practical, yet it contained depths of disappointment that everyone present could recognize. This was not how the story was supposed to unfold. Matthew and Mary should have found their way back to each other, should have provided the fairy tale conclusion that would have made sense of all the earlier heartbreak. "Do you know her?" Robert asked, grasping for some detail that might make this development feel less like a complete catastrophe. "Not yet," Isabel admitted. "Apparently, they met when he was in England last time. It all seems rather hurried." The word hurried carried particular significance in wartime. Everyone understood the desperate urgency that drove couples to the altar with unprecedented speed, the need to grasp at happiness while it was still within reach. When the future could be measured in days rather than years, traditional courtship rituals seemed like unaffordable luxuries. "You can't blame them for wanting to live in the present," Robert said, though his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. The conversation continued with the careful politeness of people navigating through emotional wreckage, but the fundamental damage had been done. Matthew, their heir, their hope for the future, had chosen someone else, someone they didn't know, someone who existed entirely outside the careful calculations that had governed their expectations. As the discussion moved toward practical arrangements for Matthew's visit, each participant retreated into their own private thoughts. The future they had imagined, the one in which Matthew and Mary eventually found their way back to each other, had just been erased with a few carefully chosen words. The sound of footsteps on gravel drew little attention from the groundskeepers, who were used to the comings and goings of the family and their guests. But Sybil's walk across the grounds carried a different quality, the measured pace of someone wrestling with emotions too large for easy containment. She had been crying, though she had made an effort to compose herself before returning to the house. The autumn air carried the bite of approaching winter, and she pulled her coat closer as she approached the main entrance. Inside the hall, the evidence of morning's preparations remained scattered about like the aftermath of a particularly energetic storm. Workmen had departed, leaving behind the skeleton of a stage and the lingering smell of sawdust and fresh paint. The space felt different now, less like a private family home and more like a public venue, as if the war had breached the walls in ways that went beyond mere fundraising necessity. Isabel emerged from the inner hall with the brisk efficiency of someone who had accomplished one difficult task and was preparing to tackle the next. When she saw Sybil approaching, her healthcare instincts immediately registered the signs of distress that the young woman was attempting to conceal. "There you are," Isabel said warmly. "I'm just going home, but I'll be back at 4. She moved closer, her trained eye taking in the slight redness around Sybil's eyes, the particular stillness that suggested someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. "Sybil, my dear, what is it?" The gentle inquiry was enough to crack the brittle shell of composure that Sybil had constructed during her walk. The words came out in a rush, as if she needed to expel them before they poisoned her entirely. "Tom Belassus has been killed. I had a letter this morning from Imogen Bunting. She heard he was missing and called on Lady Belassus, but he's dead. It's been confirmed." The name meant nothing to Isabel, but she understood immediately the weight it carried for Sybil. Another young man erased from the world, another future extinguished, another thread in the tapestry of their social world severed forever. "What a terrible thing," Isabel murmured, though the words felt pitifully inadequate in the face of such loss. "I remember him at Imogen's ball," Sybil continued, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone revisiting a memory that had suddenly become precious beyond measure. "He made me laugh out loud, just as her uncle was giving a speech." The tears were coming again, despite her efforts to control them. The image of Tom Belassus, young, vital, full of the particular energy that made people memorable at parties, seemed to shimmer in the air between them like a ghost demanding acknowledgement. "Sometimes it feels as if all the men I ever danced with are dead." The words fell from her lips with the weight of absolute truth. This was the reality of her generation. The systematic erasure of an entire cohort of young men who should have been dancing at wedding receptions and bouncing children on their knees and growing old with stories to tell their grandchildren. Instead, they were becoming names carved into stone, photographs that would never age, memories that would have to sustain the people who survived them. Isabel's heart contracted at the raw pain in Sybil's voice. This was what the war was doing to the young women of England, not just robbing them of sweethearts and potential husbands, but stealing their faith in the future itself. How did you plan for tomorrow when tomorrow kept disappearing in great sheets of flame and explosion? "I just feel so useless," Sybil continued, anger now mixing with grief in her voice. "Wasting my life while they sacrifice theirs." The frustration was palpable, the sense of a young woman with energy and intelligence and passion, who found herself relegated to the sidelines of the most important event of her lifetime, while young men her age were dying for principles she believed in. She was reduced to selling programs and organizing tombolas. Useful work, certainly, but nothing that seemed proportional to the magnitude of what was happening. "You've been a tremendous help with the concert," Isabel offered, though she could see immediately that such conventional reassurance would not be sufficient. "No, I don't mean selling programs or finding prizes for the tombola," Sybil said with fierce intensity. "I want to do a real job, real work." The declaration hung in the air between them, charged with all the transformative energy that the war was unleashing upon traditional expectations. Here was a young woman of the highest social rank, expressing a desire that would have been inconceivable just a few years earlier, the wish to engage in actual labor, to contribute something meaningful to the great struggle that was consuming their world. Isabel studied Sybil's face, seeing there a determination that reminded her forcibly of herself at a similar age. This was not the passing fancy of a bored aristocrat looking for novelty, but something deeper, a genuine calling that had crystallized in the face of unbearable loss. "Well, if you're serious," she said carefully, "what about being an auxiliary nurse? There's a training college in York. I know I could get you onto a course." The offer fell into the space between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Nursing was respectable work, sanctioned by royal example and patriotic necessity. Yet it was also real work, demanding, difficult, potentially dangerous, and absolutely essential. Would you, really? Sybil's response was immediate and fierce, hope blazing in her eyes like a flame suddenly given oxygen. If you'd like me to, but... Isabel paused, knowing that honesty was required here, even if it was unwelcome. It may be something of a rough awakening. Are you ready for that? Have you ever made your own bed, for example, or scrubbed a floor? The practical questions were not meant to discourage, but to ensure that Sybil understood what she was proposing to undertake. The war had created opportunities for women of her class that had never existed before, but those opportunities came with costs that were not always immediately apparent. As they continued their conversation, both women understood that they were negotiating more than just the details of a nursing course. They were discussing the terms of Sybil's transformation from ornamental aristocrat to essential worker, from protected daughter to independent woman. The world was changing with bewildering speed, and those who could not adapt would be left behind by history itself. The grief that had driven Sybil to this moment, the accumulated weight of too many losses, too many young men who would never again make anyone laugh at inappropriate moments, was being transmuted into something else. Purpose, direction, the determination to ensure that their sacrifices would not be in vain. In the great hall of Downton Abbey, surrounded by the evidence of a world in transition, two women planned a future that neither of them could have imagined just a few years earlier. And in that planning, they were participating in one of the war's most profound transformations, the liberation of an entire generation of women from the comfortable constraints that had once defined their possibilities. That evening, the air in Mary's bedroom was thick with the scent of lavender water and the quiet tension of last-minute preparations. Anna moved with her usual silent efficiency, fastening the tiny mother-of-pearl buttons on the back of Mary's evening gown, the silk rustling like whispers in the firelight. Cora, Sybil, and Edith had gathered, transforming the room into a feminine sanctum buzzing with the energy of the impending concert. Mary, however, seemed immune to the excitement. She stood before the looking-glass, her reflection showing a woman of exquisite poise, yet her eyes held a weariness that had nothing to do with a long day. "Glad to be back?" Sybil asked, ever the optimist. "I'm never sure," Mary replied, her voice carrying a trace of London sophistication that felt both elegant and out of place. "When I'm in London, I long for Yorkshire, and when I'm here, I ache to hear my heels clicking on the pavement. I'd forgotten about this nightmare concert. Why didn't you warn me? I'd have come back tomorrow." Edith, who had been observing her sister with a predator's patience, saw her opening. She delivered the line with surgical precision, designed for maximum impact. "But you'd have missed Matthew." The name dropped into the room like a shard of ice. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Mary's back stiffened, but she did not turn. Instead, her eyes met her mother's in the mirror. "I was going to tell you," Cora said gently. "Matthew's on leave and he's in the village, so Papa and I thought it would be a good time to mend our fences. He's coming tonight, with Isabel." A flicker of something, relief, apprehension, perhaps even hope, passed across Mary's face. But before it could settle, Edith twisted the knife. "And his fiancée?" The word was an explosion in the quiet room. Mary froze, her reflection a perfect, beautiful statue of disbelief. What? The word was a sharp, brittle crack in her composure. Matthew's engaged, Sybil confirmed softly, her voice filled with sympathy. He's brought her to Downton to meet his mother. For a single, terrible second, Mary's world collapsed. A white-hot flash of pain seared through her, so intense it threatened to steal the breath from her lungs. She could feel her sister's and mother's eyes on her, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, and that, more than anything else, was what saved her. The Crawley pride, the deep, instinctual horror of being seen as a tragic, pitied figure, rose like an iron wall inside her. I will not be the tragic figure in this story. Not tonight. She took a slow, deliberate breath. The mask of the Earl's daughter settled back into place, flawless and impenetrable. She turned from the mirror, a faint, cool smile touching her lips. Well, how marvelous. The word was a masterpiece of emotional engineering. It conveyed polite surprise, a hint of sophisticated detachment, and not a single trace of the devastation that was consuming her from within. You don't mind? Sybil asked, astonished by her sister's resilience. Why should I? Mary replied, her voice as smooth as polished marble. We're not going to marry, but I don't want him to spend the rest of his life in a cave. Please try to be happy for him. Then, in a brilliant act of self-preservation, she seized control of the narrative, deflecting all attention from her own shattered heart. Of course I'm happy. Good luck to him. Anyway, there's someone I want you all to meet. Have you ever come across Richard Carlyle? Her mother and sisters exchanged confused glances. Mary watched them, her mind a cold, calculating engine of survival. She would build a fortress around her pain, and Sir Richard Carlyle would be its first stone. The conversation turned to this new, mysterious suitor, and Mary answered their questions with perfect poise. As they filed out of the room to go downstairs, she smiled brightly, a perfect portrait of a woman with a promising future. I'll be with you in 1 minute, she called after them. The moment the door clicked shut, the performance ended. The carefully constructed facade dissolved. Her face, which seconds before had been a mask of elegant control, crumpled like a discarded letter. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips, a sound of such profound agony that it seemed to shake her entire body. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, but it was the silent, sympathetic face of the maid behind her that she saw. In that moment, the great gulf between lady and servant vanished, leaving only 2 women in a room, one heartbroken, and the other a steadfast witness to her pain. Are you all right, milady? Anna asked softly, her voice filled with a loyalty that went far beyond duty. Mary turned, her composure utterly gone, and the name she spoke was a plea, a confession, and a desperate cry for comfort all at once. Oh, Hannah. Her face fell into her hands, and the sobs came freely now, the sound of a heart breaking in the quiet of a great house preparing for a party.